Cold open, the night the skies opened. On the night of April 13, 2024, 331 drones and missiles were launched from Iranian soil toward a single country. It was the first direct military attack Iran had ever launched against Israel in more than 7 decades of enmity. The world held its breath. Most of the projectiles were intercepted by Israeli air defenses, by American warships in the Mediterranean, by Jordanian fighter jets, by British aircraft scrambled from Cyprus. But the fact of the attack was irreversible. Something had changed. A line that had existed, invisible but absolute, for 70 years had been crossed. And the question that had haunted the Middle East for decades, the question that every intelligence analyst, every diplomat, every soldier in the region had been trained to dread, was suddenly, terrifyingly, present. Was this how it began? This is the story of how two nations arrived at that night. It is a story that begins not with missiles, but with handshakes, with a time, almost impossible to imagine now, when Iran and Israel were not enemies at all. It is a story of revolution and betrayal, of proxy armies and targeted assassinations, of nuclear secrets and underwater pipelines and the particular, intimate hatred that can only develop between countries that once knew each other well. It is, above all, a story about the human beings caught inside it, the soldiers and spies and civilians and children who live and have lived at the intersection of two nations' most dangerous ambitions. How did it come to this? And where does it end? Act 1. Allies in the desert, Iran and Israel before the revolution. To understand the depth of the enmity between Iran and Israel today, you must first understand that it was not always there. In the 1950s and 1960s, Iran and Israel were something approaching allies, quiet, unacknowledged, strategically convenient allies, but allies nonetheless. The logic was cold and simple. Both nations existed in a region dominated by Arab states that wished them gone. Israel had fought for its existence since its founding in 1948, surrounded by neighbors who had declared war on the day of its birth. Iran, Shia Muslim, Persian, culturally distinct from the Arab world that surrounded it, shared the suspicion, if not always the enmity, of its Arab neighbors. Both countries were anti-Soviet in the Cold War calculus. Both were aligned, in their different ways, with the United States. The enemy of my enemy, in the Middle East as elsewhere, is a relationship with a long and complicated history. The relationship between the two countries in this era was never publicly acknowledged. Iran's government could not be seen to embrace a Jewish state while presenting itself as a supporter of Islamic solidarity. But behind the scenes, the cooperation was real and substantial. Israeli agricultural experts trained Iranian farmers. Israeli military advisors worked with Iranian security services. The two countries' intelligence agencies, Mossad and Savak, shared information on common adversaries, particularly on the movements of Arab nationalist groups and Soviet-aligned actors in the region. There was even, for a time, an oil pipeline, the Trans-Israel Pipeline, running from Eilat on the Red Sea to Ashkelon on the Mediterranean, that transported Iranian oil to European markets. Trade moved. People moved. In the Tehran of the 1960s and early 1970s, there was an Israeli mission, not quite an embassy but something close to it. Israeli businesspeople and technicians lived and worked in Iran. Iranian students studied in Israel. This period is now so thoroughly buried under the weight of what came after that it is almost impossible to recover emotionally, almost impossible to sit with the fact that there was a time when Israelis and Iranians knew each other, worked beside each other, shared meals. But it happened. And its ending, the speed and totality of its ending, tells us something essential about the nature of political transformation, and about how completely a revolution can remake a country's relationship with the world. The Shah of Iran, Mohammad Reza Pahlavi, was many things: modernizer, autocrat, American client, Persian nationalist, and a man whose grip on power was, by the mid-1970s, more precarious than he or his foreign sponsors wished to believe. His secret police, Savak, was feared throughout Iranian society. His westernization program had created a middle class that wanted more freedom than he was prepared to give. His relationship with Islamic clerics, the traditional backbone of Iranian society, was hostile and deteriorating. And his closest ally, the United States, was itself weakened by Vietnam and Watergate, and the credibility crisis that had hollowed out American power. In the holy city of Najaf, Iraq, an elderly cleric named Ruhollah Khomeini had been in exile for years, expelled from Iran by the Shah, broadcasting his opposition through cassette tapes that were smuggled across the border and passed from hand to hand in a country that had no other way to hear dissent. His message was simple, fierce, and total. The Shah was a servant of American imperialism and Zionism. Islam was under assault. The faithful had a duty to act. The cassette tapes spread. The mosques filled. And in 1979, the Shah fled. Act 2. The revolution that remade the map. The Iranian Revolution of 1979 was one of the most consequential political events of the 20th century. It ended a monarchy that had ruled Iran for 2,500 years in its various incarnations. It established the world's first modern Islamic theocracy. It exported a religious and political ideology that would reshape movements and conflicts from Lebanon to Gaza to Iraq to Yemen. And it transformed, overnight, a quiet strategic partnership into one of the defining entities of the modern era. For Israel, the fall of the Shah was a catastrophe of the first order. Not because of sentiment. There was no particular affection between the Israeli government and the Shah's regime, but because of strategic reality. Iran shared a border with Iraq, which was hostile to Israel. It controlled the Strait of Hormuz, through which much of the world's oil supply moved. It was large, populous, and potentially powerful in ways that its Arab neighbors were not. And it had been, however quietly, a partner. Now it was not. Khomeini's government made its position clear within weeks of taking power. The Israeli mission in Tehran was handed over to the Palestine Liberation Organization. The slogan "Death to Israel, Mard Bar Israel" became a fixture of official Iranian rhetoric, chanted at Friday prayers, painted on murals, embedded in the language of the state. Israel was referred to not by its name, but as the Zionist entity, a formulation designed to deny its legitimacy as a nation at the level of language itself. For the ordinary Iranians who had lived through the revolution, who had marched against the Shah with genuine hope for something better, the speed and totality of the new government's anti-Israel posture was not necessarily what they had marched for. Many Iranians who participated in the revolution were motivated by democratic aspirations, by opposition to the Shah's authoritarianism, by economic grievances. The theocracy that emerged was not what most of them had imagined. And the obsessive focus on Israel, a country that most Iranians had little direct connection to, struck many of them as a displacement, a way of unifying the population around an external enemy at the moment when the internal contradictions of the new state were most exposed. This is a pattern that the history of the Iran-Israel conflict returns to repeatedly: the gap between the state's declared position and the population's actual feelings. Surveys of Iranians, difficult to conduct and necessarily imprecise, given the restrictions on free expression inside the country, consistently suggest that popular hostility toward Israel is far lower than official rhetoric implies. The conflict, at the level of governments and ideologies, burns at a temperature that most ordinary people on both sides have never chosen and would not, if given the choice, sustain. But ordinary people are rarely given the choice. Revolutions make their choices for them. And the Islamic Republic of Iran, from 1979 onward, had made its choice about Israel with the finality of a door slamming shut. What neither side fully understood in those early years was that the conflict they were entering would not be fought primarily by armies on open battlefields. It would be fought in the shadows, in the networks of proxy forces and intelligence operations and covert assassinations and financial transfers and smuggled weapons that constitute the particular grammar of modern statecraft when two countries are too dangerous to fight directly. The shadow war had begun. Act 3, Hezbollah, the weapon that Iran built. In the summer of 1982, Israel invaded Lebanon. The stated purpose was to destroy the Palestine Liberation Organization, which had been using southern Lebanon as a base for attacks on northern Israel. The invasion achieved that objective, partly. The PLO was expelled from Lebanon, relocating to Tunis. But in the chaos and violence of the occupation that followed, something else was created, something that would prove, in the long run, far more dangerous to Israel than the PLO had ever been. Iran sent Revolutionary Guard advisors to Lebanon's Bekaa Valley in the wake of the Israeli invasion. They found a Shia population, the largest single religious community in Lebanon, and one that had been systematically marginalized by the country's political system, that was simultaneously enraged by the Israeli occupation and eager for a patron who took them seriously. The Revolutionary Guards brought money, weapons, training, and an ideology. They found recruits who brought local knowledge, ferocity, and a grievance that needed no external amplification. Hezbollah, the Party of God, was born from this meeting of need and capability. It was not simply an Iranian puppet, as Western and Israeli analysts sometimes portrayed it. It was a genuinely Lebanese movement with genuinely Lebanese roots and a genuinely Lebanese political base. But it was also, from the beginning, deeply integrated into the Iranian security apparatus, funded by Tehran, armed by Tehran, ideologically aligned with the Islamic Republic's vision of resistance to Israel and American influence in the region. For Israel, Hezbollah represented something genuinely new, a non-state military organization that combined guerrilla warfare, political organization, social services, and sophisticated weapons procurement in ways that no previous adversary had managed. It fought the Israeli occupation of southern Lebanon for 18 years. When Israel finally withdrew in May 2000, in what Prime Minister Ehud Barak called a unilateral withdrawal, and which Hezbollah called, accurately, a defeat, the organization emerged with its credibility vastly enhanced throughout the Arab and Muslim worlds. The 2006 Lebanon War, triggered by a Hezbollah cross-border raid that killed 3 Israeli soldiers and captured 2, was the next and most intense round. Israel launched a 34-day air and ground campaign aimed at destroying Hezbollah's military capacity. It failed. Hezbollah fired approximately 4,000 rockets into northern Israel, killing 44 Israeli civilians and displacing over 1 million people. Israeli military operations killed approximately 1,100 Lebanese civilians and displaced over 1 million Lebanese. When the fighting stopped, Hezbollah's Secretary General Hassan Nasrallah declared a divine victory. Israeli military analysts agreed, quietly and painfully, that the organization had not been defeated. What had been demonstrated, in 34 days of fire, was the central strategic logic of Iran's approach to Israel, not a direct confrontation that Iran would likely lose, but a ring of armed proxies, Hezbollah in Lebanon, Hamas and Islamic Jihad in Gaza, the Houthis in Yemen, various Shia militias in Iraq and Syria, that could apply continuous pressure at acceptable cost. Each of these organizations had its own interests and its own leadership. None of them were simply remote-controlled instruments of Tehran. But all of them received Iranian support, weapons, training, financing, intelligence, and all of them were united by their opposition to Israel and to the American presence in the region. Israeli strategists called this the axis of resistance. They watched it develop with a mixture of alarm and something that, by the 2010s, had become a kind of cold professional admiration for its architecture. It was, whatever else it was, a sophisticated strategic construction, a way of projecting power across a region without directly committing Iranian military forces to a conflict that could trigger a devastating response. The question that Israeli planners asked themselves, in the classified discussions that would occasionally surface in leaks and memoirs, was, how do you defeat a strategy built around indefinite, distributed, deniable pressure? You cannot bomb your way out of it. You cannot negotiate your way out of it. You can only, and this was the answer that Israeli intelligence kept returning to, attack the source. Act 4, the nuclear question, the shadow over everything. It is impossible to understand the Iran-Israel conflict without understanding that both sides conducted in the shadow of a single, overriding question, nuclear weapons. Israel has possessed nuclear weapons since the late 1960s, a fact that has never been officially confirmed by the Israeli government, which maintains a policy of deliberate ambiguity, either confirming nor denying what virtually every intelligence service in the world has concluded is true. Israel is believed to possess between 80 and 400 nuclear warheads, depending on the estimate. They are, by any assessment, the most powerful military force in the Middle East. Iran does not possess nuclear weapons. But Iran has, for decades, pursued a nuclear program whose full extent and ultimate intention has been the subject of the most intense intelligence effort in the history of modern espionage. The Islamic Republic insists that its program is entirely peaceful, aimed at civilian energy production and medical research. The United States, Israel, and most European governments have concluded that Iran's program has, at various points, had a weapons dimension, that Iran has been developing the capability to build a nuclear weapon without quite taking the final step of building one. This distinction between capability and weapon is, in the world of nuclear strategy, enormous. A country that possesses nuclear capability but not a weapon exists in a zone of deliberate ambiguity that provides some of the deterrent value of a weapon without the political cost of having actually built one. Iran's leadership has been, for decades, cultivating this ambiguity with considerable skill. For Israel, Iranian nuclear ambiguity is not a comfortable strategic position to live with. It is an existential threat. Not because Iranian nuclear capability is immediately likely to produce an Iranian nuclear strike on Israel. The logic of deterrence that has prevented nuclear war for 80 years applies here as elsewhere, but because the existence of Iranian nuclear capability would fundamentally alter the balance of power in the region, would embolden Iran's proxy network, would constrain Israeli freedom of action, and would, in the nightmare scenario that Israeli planners are constitutionally unable to stop contemplating, eventually produce a weapon in the hands of a government that has repeatedly called for Israel's elimination. The Israeli response to this threat has been, in part, military: the development of missile defense systems, the maintenance of overwhelming conventional military superiority, the preparation of strike plans against Iranian nuclear facilities that have been briefed to multiple Israeli cabinets and debated endlessly. But it has also been covert. Operation Olympic Games, the joint American-Israeli cyber attack that deployed the Stuxnet worm against Iranian uranium centrifuges between 2007 and 2010, was the most sophisticated act of cyber warfare ever conducted up to that point. The worm caused centrifuges at the Natanz facility to spin at destructive speeds while reporting normal operation to their monitors, a form of industrial sabotage so precise that it required intelligence about the specific equipment in use that could only have come from deep penetration of Iran's nuclear program. Iranian engineers spent months trying to understand why their centrifuges were failing. By the time Stuxnet was discovered and analyzed by an independent cybersecurity firm, working backward from the worm's behavior, it had destroyed nearly 1,000 centrifuges and set back Iran's enrichment program by an estimated 2 years. It had also demonstrated, to every intelligence service in the world, that the threshold for acts of war had been fundamentally redefined. But the centrifuges could be replaced. New ones were built. The program continued. And so did the covert war, escalating, in the 2010s, into something that had no precedent: a systematic campaign of targeted assassination against Iran's nuclear scientists. Between 2010 and 2012, 4 Iranian nuclear scientists were killed in Tehran, shot by gunmen on motorcycles, or by magnetic bombs attached to their cars in the morning traffic. A 5th survived an assassination attempt. The operations bore the hallmarks of Mossad: the precision, the intelligence penetration required, the operational complexity of working inside a police state. Israel never confirmed its involvement. Iran blamed Israel and the United States. The scientists who were killed were real people with families and careers and the ordinary texture of human lives, a fact that tends to get lost in the strategic abstraction. In November 2020, Mohsen Fakhrizadeh, described by Western intelligence as the father of Iran's nuclear weapons program, was killed on a highway outside Tehran by a remotely operated machine gun, reportedly smuggled into Iran piece by piece and assembled in place. The operation, which Israeli intelligence had reportedly been planning for years, was executed with a precision that astonished even experienced analysts. It was also, by any definition, an act of war, conducted on Iranian soil, against an Iranian citizen, by a foreign intelligence service. Iran promised revenge. It always promises revenge. The accounting of promises kept and broken in this conflict would fill a library. But the nuclear program, despite all the sabotage, all the assassinations, all the sanctions, all the diplomacy, continued. Act 5, Syria, the war inside the war. When the Syrian civil war began in 2011, when protests against the Assad government were met with bullets, and bullets were met with armed resistance, and armed resistance spiraled into one of the most catastrophic conflicts of the 21st century, it created, amid its horror, a new theater for the Iran-Israel shadow war. Iran intervened in Syria decisively and early. The Assad government was Iran's most important Arab ally, the land bridge through which weapons could flow from Iran to Hezbollah in Lebanon. Its survival was not optional from Tehran's perspective. Iranian Revolutionary Guard commanders were embedded with Syrian forces. Hezbollah fighters crossed the border in significant numbers to fight alongside government troops. Iranian financing flowed into Damascus. By 2013, Iran's intervention had almost certainly saved the Assad government from the collapse that many analysts had predicted. But Iranian presence in Syria created an opportunity that Israeli military planners had not fully anticipated: a target set. Iranian weapons convoys moving through Syria toward Lebanon could be struck before they arrived. Iranian military infrastructure being established in Syria, air bases, weapons depots, missile factories, could be hit before it became operational. Iranian advisors moving between Damascus and the Lebanese border could, in some cases, be targeted. Israel began conducting airstrikes in Syria in 2013. By 2023, it had conducted hundreds, perhaps over 1,000, strikes on Syrian territory, targeting weapons shipments, Iranian-linked facilities, Hezbollah infrastructure, and on several occasions, Iranian Revolutionary Guard officers. The strikes were conducted under a policy of ambiguity that Israel maintained almost to the point of absurdity. For years, official Israeli spokespersons declined to confirm or deny individual strikes even as the craters were still smoking. The operational logic was cold and consistent: degrade Iran's ability to arm Hezbollah, prevent the establishment of Iranian military infrastructure on Israel's northern border, impose a cost on Iran for its regional expansion without triggering a direct confrontation that could escalate beyond control. It was, by the standards of the conflict, a success, in the sense that the weapons transfers were slowed, though never stopped, and the direct confrontation was, for a decade, avoided. But the strikes also killed people. Iranian officers, Syrian soldiers, Hezbollah operatives, and occasionally, civilians. The human texture of each strike, the families that were shattered, the individuals who died in facilities that intelligence assessments had described as legitimate military targets, is largely invisible in the strategic accounting. It exists. It matters. And on the Iranian and Syrian sides, it accumulated into a ledger of grievance that was, strike by strike, being filled. Iranian commanders in Syria did not simply absorb the losses. They established new facilities further from the Israeli border. They developed more sophisticated concealment methods. They moved weapons at night, in civilian vehicles, through routes that Israeli surveillance was less likely to cover. They also, incrementally, began developing the capacity to strike back, not in Syria, but from Syria, with rockets and missiles that could reach Israeli territory. The shadow war in Syria was not a victory for either side. It was a grinding, sustained, mutually costly process of attrition, the kind of conflict that produces no decisive moment, no clear turning point, only a slow accumulation of damage and an unresolved strategic competition that continues to define the region's most dangerous fault line. Act 6, October 7th, and the night everything changed. On October 7th, 2023, Hamas launched the deadliest attack on Jewish people since the Holocaust. The assault, which Hamas had been planning for over 2 years, under the codename Al-Aqsa Flood, began before dawn with a massive rocket barrage that overwhelmed Israel's Iron Dome system through sheer volume. Simultaneously, thousands of Hamas fighters breached the security fence around Gaza at dozens of points, using drones to disable surveillance cameras and communications towers, paragliders to cross over the fence, and bulldozers to tear through it. They poured into the kibbutzim and towns of southern Israel, into Kfar Aza, Be'eri, Nir Az, Sderot, into the open desert of the Nova Music Festival. What happened in those hours belongs to a category of atrocity that strains the capacity of language to hold. 1,200 people were killed. 253 were taken hostage into Gaza. The dead included infants, elderly people, entire families. People were burned in their homes. People were killed while hiding in safe rooms that turned out not to be safe. The nature and scale of the violence was documented with a thoroughness that made denial impossible. By body cameras worn by the perpetrators, by the messages sent by victims in their final minutes, by the testimonies of survivors who emerged from hiding, days later, into a world that had been fundamentally altered. Iran's role in October 7th remains a subject of ongoing intelligence and diplomatic debate. Iranian officials expressed support for the attack, calling it a natural response to Israeli policies. Hamas confirmed that Iran had provided financial and military support over the years of preparation. Whether Iranian leadership had advanced knowledge of the specific timing and scale of the operation, and if so, how much, is a question that has not been definitively resolved. The United States assessed, in the weeks after the attack, that Iran was broadly complicit but may not have had specific prior knowledge of October 7th as an event. What is not in dispute is that the war that followed, Israel's military campaign in Gaza, which has been among the most intense and destructive of the 21st century, created the conditions for the direct Iranian attack of April 2024. Iran, watching its proxy Hamas being systematically dismantled in Gaza, watching Hezbollah accept significant losses in Israeli strikes on its senior leadership, facing a moment when the credibility of its axis of resistance strategy was visibly under strain, made a decision to cross the line it had always, before, stopped short of. The attack of April 13th, 331 drones and missiles, most intercepted, a few breaking through, was framed by Iran as a legitimate response to an Israeli airstrike that had killed 7 Iranian Revolutionary Guard officers in Damascus 2 weeks earlier. The mathematics of the response, the scale, the publicity, the advance warning that Iran transmitted to neighboring governments, suggested that the attack was calibrated as much for messaging as for military effect. Iran wanted to demonstrate that it could and would strike Israel directly. It also, apparently, wanted to avoid triggering a full-scale war. Israel's response was equally calibrated. A limited strike on a radar installation in Isfahan, demonstrating the ability to penetrate Iranian air defenses without the political cost of a massive escalation. A message without a war. But the messages were now being written in a new language. Direct. Acknowledged. Government to government, missile to missile. The threshold that had governed this conflict for 45 years, the implicit agreement that the shadow war would remain a shadow war, had been openly challenged. And neither side had yet decided what to build in its place. Act 7, the human dimension, lives on the fault line. Somewhere in Tehran, a woman whose son serves in the Revolutionary Guard reads the news about the April attack and feels, what? Pride, as the state insists she should feel? Fear that her son might be the next target of an Israeli airstrike? Exhaustion, at the perpetual state of crisis that has defined her country's political life for her entire adult existence? Somewhere in Tel Aviv, a man who survived the Nova Music Festival, who ran when the rockets came, who hid in a ditch for 6 hours, who watched people die around him, is in therapy, trying to rebuild something that resembles ordinary life. He thinks about Iran sometimes. He doesn't think about it the way the politicians do, in strategic calculations and deterrence theory. He thinks about it the way people think about things that have taken something from them. The human cost of the Iran-Israel conflict is not easily tallied because much of it is invisible in the ways that chronic, sustained, low-intensity conflict always makes its costs invisible. It is in the Israelis who live within range of Hezbollah's rockets and have spent years planning escape routes and identifying safe rooms. It is in the Lebanese civilians who have been displaced, wounded, or killed in Israeli strikes on Hezbollah targets, people who did not choose to live alongside a military organization and were not consulted about the strategic utility of their neighborhoods. It is in the Iranian engineers who work on the nuclear program and know, at some level, that their profession has made them targets. It is in the families of the scientists who were assassinated, families who have spoken, in interviews given to journalists willing to make the difficult journey to their doorsteps, with a grief that does not organize itself around ideology. The grief is just grief. It does not care about deterrence theory. It is in the young Iranian men who are sent to Syria as Revolutionary Guard advisors and come home changed, or do not come home at all, their deaths announced in official statements that describe them as defenders of the holy shrines, a formulation designed to give their deaths religious meaning while avoiding any acknowledgement of what they were actually doing in a foreign country. It is in the Israeli soldiers who have served in Lebanon, in Gaza, in the northern border regions, who have fought in the spaces where Iranian strategy and Israeli security collide, and who carry the specific weight of a conflict that has no clear end, no achievable victory condition, no moment at which the fighting stops and the accounting begins. The conflict between Iran and Israel is, at the level of governments and ideologies, a clash of large forces, theocracy and democracy, regional hegemony and national survival, revolutionary Islam and Zionist nationalism. These are real forces with real consequences. But they are, ultimately, enacted by people, by specific human beings who wake up on specific mornings in specific apartments and make specific choices, or have specific choices made for them, and live with the results. This is the dimension of the conflict that strategy cannot capture. And it is, arguably, the most important one. Act 8. The weapons, the walls, and the invisible battlefield. Modern warfare between Iran and Israel is not waged primarily on open ground. It is waged in the electromagnetic spectrum, in the cyberspace that connects every piece of critical infrastructure to every other piece, and where a well-designed piece of malware can do more damage than a missile strike. It is waged in the banking system, through financial sanctions and counter-sanctions and the labyrinthine networks through which Iran moves money to fund operations that it cannot publicly acknowledge. It is waged in the ports and airports through which weapons move, disguised as commercial cargo, intercepted sometimes and not others. The Israeli Navy has, over the past decade, conducted a sustained campaign to interdict arms shipments bound for Hezbollah and other Iranian-backed groups, intercepting vessels in the Red Sea, the Mediterranean, and the Persian Gulf, seizing weapons caches that include rockets, anti-tank missiles, and, in at least one documented case, equipment for precision guidance systems that would dramatically increase Hezbollah's missile accuracy. Iran's cyber capabilities have grown substantially in the years since Stuxnet taught Iranian engineers, in the most painful possible way, what sophisticated cyber warfare could accomplish. Iran has conducted cyber attacks on Israeli water treatment facilities, on Israeli hospital systems, on Israeli financial institutions. The attacks have generally been less sophisticated than the Stuxnet operation but more numerous, a kind of cyber harassment that keeps Israeli security services in a permanent state of elevated readiness without delivering a decisive blow. The precision missile program is the development that Israeli security planners find most alarming. For years, Hezbollah's rocket arsenal was large but inaccurate, capable of causing terror and civilian casualties, but unable to reliably hit specific targets. Iran has been working, through a combination of technology transfers and in-country manufacturing capacity, to convert Hezbollah's rockets into precision-guided missiles. A precision missile that can hit a specific building, an air base, a power plant, an intelligence headquarters, is a qualitatively different weapon from an unguided rocket that lands somewhere in a city. The difference is the difference between a blunt instrument and a scalpel. Israel's interception of this precision conversion program, through the Syria strikes, through the assassination of specific engineers, through the seizure of components in transit, has been partially successful. Partially. The program has been slowed. It has not been stopped. Iron Dome, David's Sling, Arrow, Israel's layered missile defense system is the most sophisticated in the world, and it demonstrated its capability on April 13 in ways that impressed even skeptical military analysts. But no missile defense system is perfect. The April attack broke through in some places. Future attacks, with larger salvos or more sophisticated maneuvering warheads or electronic countermeasures, could break through in more places. The defenders know this. The attackers know this. The mathematical logic of offense and defense, that it is easier and cheaper to build missiles than to build the systems that intercept them, is a permanent feature of the strategic landscape. And behind all of it, always, is the nuclear question. The question that no amount of cyber attacks or assassinations or interceptions has resolved. Iran's nuclear program has survived everything that has been thrown at it. It has survived Stuxnet. It has survived assassinations. It has survived sanctions that cost the Iranian economy hundreds of billions of dollars. It has survived multiple rounds of international negotiations, most notably the 2015 Joint Comprehensive Plan of Action, from which the United States withdrew in 2018 under the Trump administration, triggering an Iranian decision to accelerate enrichment to levels with no plausible civilian justification. As of 2024, Iran is enriching uranium to 60% purity, below the 90% needed for a weapon, but far above the 5% appropriate for civilian power generation. The distance between 60% and a weapon is, in the judgment of most nuclear analysts, a matter of weeks, if Iran decided to take the final steps. Iran has not taken those steps. But the capability is real, and it is close, and the question of what Israel, or the United States, might do if Iran appeared to be approaching that threshold is the most dangerous question in the Middle East. Act 9. The Diplomacy of Impossibility. Every few years, someone proposes a diplomatic solution to the Iran-Israel conflict. The proposals vary in their details but share a common structure. Iran would constrain its nuclear program and reduce its support for proxy groups. Israel would accept Iranian security interests in the region. The United States would provide guarantees and remove sanctions, and the two countries would arrive at some kind of stable, if cold, coexistence. The proposals keep failing. They fail for structural reasons that are worth understanding, because the failure is not simply a matter of bad faith or insufficient creativity on the part of negotiators. For Iran, the Islamic Republic's identity is bound up, at a foundational level, with opposition to Israel. The slogan "Death to Israel" is not diplomatic rhetoric that can be walked back in a negotiation. It is a pillar of the revolutionary ideology that legitimizes the Islamic Republic's existence. A government that made peace with Israel, that accepted, in any form, the legitimacy of a Jewish state in the Middle East, would be undermining one of the central premises of its own authority. This is not to say that no Iranian government could ever make such a move. History has seen stranger things. But it would require a transformation of the political system itself, not merely a change of policy. For Israel, the structural obstacle is symmetrical but different. Israel's security establishment has, for decades, been shaped by an existential anxiety that is grounded in historical experience, in the memory of the Holocaust, in the experience of being attacked on multiple fronts in 1948, 1967, and 1973. In the knowledge that the country is small enough that a single successful attack on its major population centers could be catastrophic in ways that larger countries can absorb. This anxiety is not irrational, but it produces a risk tolerance, a willingness to take preemptive action, to strike first, to accept the costs of continuous offensive operations, that makes diplomatic compromise difficult. The United States, for its part, has been simultaneously Israel's most important ally and the principal architect of the diplomatic frameworks designed to constrain Iran's nuclear program. The tension between these roles has never been fully resolved, and the 2018 withdrawal from the JCPOA dramatically complicated the diplomatic landscape in ways that neither the Trump administration nor its successors have fully repaired. There is, in the academic literature on the conflict, a concept called the security dilemma. The phenomenon in which each side's defensive measures appear threatening to the other, triggering further defensive measures that appear threatening in turn, producing a spiral of escalation that neither side intended and neither side can easily stop. The Iran-Israel conflict is a near-perfect illustration of this concept. Every Israeli action, the Syria strikes, the assassinations, the cyber attacks, is justified in Israeli terms as defensive, aimed at preventing a larger threat from materializing. Every Iranian action, the proxy networks, the nuclear development, the missile programs, is justified in Iranian terms as defensive, aimed at deterring an Israeli attack that Iran genuinely believes is coming. Both sides are, in their own terms, right. And both sides are, in the aggregate, creating the conditions for the war that both sides officially want to avoid. ACT 10. The present danger. Where we stand now as of 2024 and into 2025, the Iran-Israel conflict has entered a phase that experts describe, with considerable unease, as direct deterrence. The April 2024 Iranian missile attack and the Israeli counterstrike in Isfahan established a new baseline. Both sides have demonstrated the capability and the will to strike each other's territory directly. The implicit agreement that had kept the conflict in the shadows for 4 decades has been partially suspended. The consequences of this shift are not yet fully visible, but they are being felt. In Lebanon, the months following October 7 saw Hezbollah engage in sustained cross-border fire with Israel. Not a war, exactly, but not peace either. Somewhere between 40 and 60,000 Israelis were displaced from communities in northern Israel, unable to return to their homes. Israel, in turn, conducted intensive strikes on Hezbollah positions in southern Lebanon. In September 2024, Israel conducted a series of operations that killed Hezbollah's Secretary General Hassan Nasrallah, the man who had led the organization for 32 years, the man who had survived every previous attempt on his life, the man who had become the public face of the axis of resistance. Nasrallah's death, in a bunker under a Beirut suburb, killed by Israeli airstrikes that collapsed the building above him, sent shockwaves through the region. It was one of the most significant targeted killings in the history of the conflict. It demonstrated Israeli intelligence penetration of Hezbollah's most senior levels at a depth that was, to observers on all sides, startling. And it raised, again, the question that the conflict always returns to: what comes next? Iran's position in the region has been weakened, in some ways significantly, by the events of 2023 and 2024. Hamas, though not destroyed, has been severely degraded as a military organization. Hezbollah has lost senior leaders and significant weapons infrastructure. The Assad government in Syria, Iran's key Arab ally, fell in December 2024, eliminating the land bridge through which Iran had moved weapons to Hezbollah for decades. These are real setbacks for Iranian strategy, and they have been absorbed by Iran's leadership with an intensity of internal debate that outside observers can only partially glimpse. But Iran's nuclear program continues. Its enrichment levels continue to rise. Its ballistic missile program, the largest in the Middle East, continues to expand and improve. And its fundamental strategic interest in opposing Israeli power in the region has not changed, regardless of the tactical setbacks its proxies have sustained. On the Israeli side, the war in Gaza has imposed costs, in international credibility, in the relationship with the United States that remains Israel's indispensable patron, in the internal political tensions of a society under sustained pressure, that have not been fully reckoned with. The images from Gaza have altered the global political conversation about Israel in ways that will have long-term consequences. The displacement and casualties in Lebanon have created conditions that could, with the wrong spark, reignite into a full-scale war. And the hostages, the 253 people taken into Gaza on October 7th, of whom dozens remain in captivity as of this writing, are a constant, agonizing reminder that the October 7th wound has not been closed. Their families march in the streets of Tel Aviv. Their faces are on the posters that cover the fences of Israeli cities. They are present in every political calculation, every ceasefire negotiation, every strategic discussion about what the end state of the Gaza campaign should look like. The conflict has no clean ending because it has no clean premise. It is rooted in questions of legitimacy and recognition and historical trauma and theological conviction and geopolitical interest that do not resolve through military force. They can be managed, suppressed, displaced. They cannot, so far, be resolved. Epilogue: the question that remains. There is a question that hangs over everything in this conflict, unspoken but present in every briefing room and every diplomatic cable and every intercepted communication. Could this become a full-scale war between Iran and Israel? Not a shadow war. Not a proxy war. not a calibrated exchange of missiles with advanced warnings and carefully limited damage. A real war, the kind that reshapes geography and populations, that produces casualties in numbers that cannot be hidden, that draws in the larger powers by logic of alliance and interest, and the terrifying mathematics of escalation. The honest answer is, yes, it could. It has not, so far. The structural factors that have kept it from becoming a full-scale war, mutual deterrence, the risk of American involvement, the economic costs that Iran cannot afford, the recognition on both sides that a direct war might produce outcomes worse for both of them than the status quo, remain in place. But they are under more strain than at any point in the past 40 years. The nuclear question, specifically, contains within it the scenario that rational actors on both sides most fear, that Iran approaches the weapons threshold, that Israel, or the United States, concludes that the window for military action is closing, and that a preemptive strike is launched, triggering an Iranian response, triggering further escalation, producing a regional conflagration that none of the participants fully intended and none of them can stop. This scenario is not inevitable. The history of nuclear deterrence is, in a dark sense, a history of catastrophes that did not happen, of moments when the worst was possible and did not occur, through a combination of calculation, communication, luck, and the occasional individual who refused to turn the key. The Iran-Israel conflict has had its versions of these moments. It may have more. What is certain is that the people who live in this conflict, the Israeli children who practice rocket drills in school, the Iranian families who have learned to navigate the gap between what the state says and what they believe, the Lebanese civilians caught between Hezbollah and the Israeli Air Force, the Syrian refugees displaced by a war that was, in part, a theater of a larger competition. These people deserve better than a conflict that defines and shapes and limits their lives without their consent. They deserve the peace that their governments have not found the will, or the way, to build. On a highway outside Tehran, in 2020, Mohsen Fakhrizadeh was killed by a machine gun operated by remote control from outside the country. On a street in Beirut, in 2024, the building above a bunker collapsed. In a field in southern Israel, in 2023, 1,200 people were killed in a single morning. History is made of moments like these. It is also made of the long intervals between them, the years of waiting and preparation and accumulation that make the moments possible. The interval we are living in now is one of those accumulations. The question is what it is accumulating toward. The world is watching. The region is waiting. And somewhere in the space between Tehran and Tel Aviv, in the shadow war's permanent twilight, the answer is being determined quietly by people whose names we may not know for years.